There is something happening inside millions of American bodies right now. Something quiet. Something that doesn't show up on a basic blood panel. Something that most doctors don't have time to explain during a 15-minute appointment. And the strangest part is that it starts in one of the most familiar moments of your entire day. It starts with your morning coffee. Think about that for a second. You wake up. Maybe it's still dark outside. The house is quiet. You move toward the kitchen almost on instinct because that first cup has been part of your morning for decades. You don't think about it. You don't question it. It's just what you do. And for most of your life, that was perfectly fine. But something shifted after 50. Something biological. Something that most people don't recognize because it doesn't announce itself with pain or obvious symptoms. It announces itself with a kind of fog. A tiredness that feels different from the tiredness you had in your 30s, a weight that settles in places it never used to settle, a mental slowness after meals that you've started to just accept as normal, a craving for something sweet in the middle of the afternoon that seems almost impossible to ignore. You've probably been told it's just age, and in one sense, yes, the body changes. Nobody disagrees with that. But here is what most people are never told. A significant portion of what we call aging after 50 is not simply the passage of time. It is metabolic. It is driven by a process happening inside your cells, quietly and continuously, that is directly influenced by what you consume, how your body processes it, and what happens in the hours after every single meal. And that process has a name. Researchers today call it metabolic aging. It is not a diagnosis. It is a biological shift that begins gradually in midlife and accelerates almost invisibly unless something interrupts it. And what makes it particularly difficult to recognize is that it looks, from the outside, exactly like getting older. The fatigue feels like age. The weight feels like age. The cognitive fog feels like age. But underneath all of that, there is a specific mechanism running that is far more responsive to daily habits than most people ever realize. Here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. This is not about fear. This is not about a list of things you're doing wrong. This is about something I've spent years studying and observing, and what I've come to believe is one of the most underappreciated conversations in health after 50. Because once you understand what's actually happening inside your body in the hours after you eat, in the hours after you drink that morning coffee, the decisions you make each day start to feel very different. They start to feel like something that actually matters. And one of the simplest decisions, one that costs almost nothing and takes no extra time, may be doing something for your metabolic health that most people have completely overlooked. If this is the kind of conversation you've been looking for, subscribe to this channel right now. We cover exactly this, the science of how your body actually works after 50, every single week. Now let me show you what's really going on. To understand what's actually happening, we need to start with glucose. Not in a clinical way. In a real, practical, this is your body every single morning kind of way. After 50, your cells become gradually less responsive to insulin. Insulin is the signal that tells your cells to open their doors and absorb glucose from the bloodstream. When those doors start to stick, glucose lingers longer than it should after every meal. You don't need to be diabetic for this to be happening. Millions of Americans have measurable insulin resistance that never triggers an alarm on a standard annual blood test. Their numbers look acceptable, and yet, day after day, glucose is sitting in the bloodstream a little longer, creating a low-level inflammatory environment that compounds silently over months and years. Think of your bloodstream as a river that needs to clear debris after every storm. When you're younger, the clearing happens fast. After 50, it slows. And when debris sits in a river long enough, it doesn't just float, it starts to damage the banks. That is what chronic low-level glucose exposure does to your blood vessels and tissues over time. It doesn't cause a dramatic event. It builds a terrain. And that terrain is what researchers associate with accelerated metabolic aging. Now, here is where your morning coffee becomes relevant in a way most people have never considered. Coffee on an empty stomach can trigger a cortisol response that temporarily affects insulin sensitivity. This is not a reason to stop drinking coffee. But it does mean that what you add to that first cup can quietly shift your metabolic response during one of the most important hormonal windows of your day. And this is where cinnamon stops being a spice and starts being something worth understanding seriously. Research published in Diabetes Care and reviewed by the National Institutes of Health has examined how specific bioactive compounds in cinnamon interact with insulin receptors on the surface of cells. What these compounds appear to do is help keep those receptors more responsive, more willing to open, more efficient at clearing glucose after a meal. The result is a smaller glucose spike, a faster return to baseline, and less time spent in that inflammatory terrain. This is not magic. This is a mechanism, a real, studied, biologically plausible mechanism, and it can be introduced into your daily routine in less than 30 seconds at essentially zero cost. What we are talking about today is one piece of a larger system. Metabolic aging is driven by sleep, movement, stress, and the accumulation of habits over years. But for people beginning to think about this seriously, cinnamon in your morning coffee is one of the most accessible entry points available. And if you want to go deeper into what a structured approach to metabolic health after 50 actually looks like, that resource is linked in the description and pinned in the comments. You can also scan the QR code on your screen right now. Take a look today. Now let's talk about what cinnamon does inside the body, step by step, because the full picture is more interesting than most people expect. Let's walk through what actually happens inside your body when metabolic aging is running unchecked. Because most people experience the symptoms without ever connecting them to a single underlying process. It starts with energy. Not the dramatic collapse kind, the quiet kind. You finish lunch and somewhere between 1 and 2 in the afternoon, a heaviness settles in. Your focus softens. Your motivation drops. You might reach for something sweet or a second cup of coffee because your body is signaling that something is off with its fuel supply. What is actually happening in that moment is a glucose curve that peaked too high after your meal and is now dropping faster than your cells can comfortably manage. Your body interprets that drop as a mild emergency and responds with cravings, fatigue, and mental fog. This cycle, repeated every single day across years, is not just uncomfortable, it is inflammatory. Each spike and drop leaves a small residue of oxidative stress in the tissues it passes through. Then it moves to the vascular system. The inner lining of your blood vessels, what researchers call the endothelium, is extraordinarily sensitive to glucose fluctuations. When glucose remains elevated for extended periods, even at levels that don't qualify as diabetic, it initiates a low-grade inflammatory response in that lining. Over time, this stiffens arteries, reduces circulation efficiency, and creates conditions that affect blood pressure and cardiovascular resilience. The American Heart Association has published extensively on the relationship between metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular risk, and what the research consistently shows is that the damage begins long before any formal diagnosis appears. And then, perhaps most quietly and most significantly, it reaches the brain. This is the part that I think deserves the most attention, and the part that most people never hear explained clearly. The brain is the most glucose-dependent organ in the body. It consumes roughly 20% of your total glucose supply, despite representing only about 2% of your body weight. When insulin signaling becomes less efficient, the brain's access to its primary fuel source becomes less reliable. Researchers at institutions including the National Institute on Aging and the journal Frontiers in Aging Neuroscience have begun describing a specific pattern of insulin resistance in brain tissue that is distinct from systemic insulin resistance. Some researchers have gone as far as associating this pattern with early cognitive changes, including the kind of memory lapses and processing slowdowns that most people attribute entirely to age. The fog you feel after meals, the names that take a half-second longer to surface, the train of thought that derails more easily than it used to. These experiences are real, and while they are not evidence of any single diagnosis, they are signals worth paying attention to. I want to tell you about a woman named Carol. She was 63 when she first heard the phrase metabolic aging. She had no formal diagnosis. Her doctor described her health as reasonable for her age, but she had been living with that afternoon crash for years. She had gained weight around her midsection in a way that felt different from anything before. She had started avoiding social plans in the evening because by 7 o'clock she simply didn't have the energy. She began adding half a teaspoon of Ceylon cinnamon to her morning coffee. Not because she expected transformation. She was honestly skeptical. 3 weeks later, she noticed she was making it to 3 in the afternoon without reaching for sugar. 6 weeks later, her evening energy had shifted enough that she accepted a dinner invitation for the first time in months. She was not cured of anything, but something in her metabolic rhythm had quietly changed. Her body was responding. That kind of gradual, functional improvement is what the research suggests is possible when insulin sensitivity improves even modestly. Not dramatic, not miraculous, but real and cumulative and meaningful in the context of daily life. If you've been watching this and recognizing yourself in what Carol experienced, you're not imagining it, and you deserve more than a single video can offer. The link in the description and the pinned comment will take you to a resource that goes much further into the full framework of metabolic support after 50. Every day this goes unaddressed is a day the process continues. Scan the QR code on your screen or find the link below. Your next step is one click away. The decision is yours. Now let's talk about the specific, practical details of how to use cinnamon correctly, because not all cinnamon is the same, and that distinction matters more than most people realize. The first thing most people discover when they start researching cinnamon seriously is that there are two completely different products sold under the same name. And this distinction is not a minor detail. It is the difference between something you can use daily with confidence and something that, in excess, can create problems of its own. The cinnamon you most commonly find in American grocery stores is called Cassia cinnamon. It is the darker, more intensely flavored variety. It is inexpensive, widely available, and the kind most people have in their spice cabinet right now. Cassia contains a compound called coumarin. In small occasional amounts, coumarin is not a concern, but coumarin in larger or more frequent doses has been associated with liver stress in people who are sensitive to it. The European Food Safety Authority has established tolerable daily intake levels for coumarin that are relatively easy to exceed if you are using cassia cinnamon in meaningful quantities every single day. Ceylon cinnamon is different. It comes from Sri Lanka, it has a lighter, more delicate flavor, and it contains dramatically lower levels of coumarin. It is sometimes called true cinnamon, and it is the variety that most of the research on insulin sensitivity and glucose metabolism has focused on. It is slightly more expensive than cassia, and not always easy to find at a standard supermarket, but it is widely available online and at specialty grocery stores. If you are going to make cinnamon a daily habit, Ceylon is the version to use. The amount that appears most consistently in the research literature is between 1/4 and 1/2 teaspoon per day. This is not a large amount. It disappears easily into a cup of coffee without dramatically altering the flavor, especially if you already drink your coffee without sugar. If you prefer a slightly stronger taste, it pairs well with a small amount of unsweetened almond milk or oat milk. Some people add it directly to their coffee grounds before brewing, which distributes it evenly and reduces any gritty texture. Others simply stir it into the finished cup. The timing matters more than most people realize. Adding it to your morning coffee is strategically useful precisely because of that early metabolic window we discussed. The first meal or drink of the day sets a kind of hormonal tone for how your body will process glucose across the following hours. Introducing a compound that supports insulin receptor sensitivity at that moment, before the day's glucose fluctuations begin, is a more intelligent approach than adding it to an afternoon snack or an evening meal. A few important notes before we go further. If you are currently managing diabetes or taking medications that affect blood sugar, please speak with your doctor before adding cinnamon to your daily routine in meaningful amounts. Cinnamon can have a measurable effect on glucose levels, and if you are already on medication for this, that interaction needs to be monitored. This is not a warning designed to discourage you. It is the kind of honest, specific guidance that I believe everyone deserves to hear clearly. for those who are not managing a glucose-related condition. The risk profile of daily Ceylon cinnamon at half a teaspoon is considered low by most nutritional researchers. It is not a pharmaceutical. It is a food compound with a long history of human consumption and a growing body of research behind its metabolic effects. What you might begin to notice in the first few weeks, if your body responds as the research suggests many do, is subtle. Less of that sharp afternoon energy drop. A slightly reduced craving for something sweet after meals. A steadier feeling of mental clarity in the hours after breakfast. These are not dramatic transformations. They are quiet shifts in metabolic rhythm, and quiet shifts, repeated daily across months, are exactly how meaningful change accumulates in the body after 50. If this conversation has been valuable to you, hit the like button right now. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And tell me in the comments, have you ever tried adding cinnamon to your coffee? I want to know what your experience has been. Now let's bring this full picture together, because there is something important I want to leave you with before we close. There is a question worth sitting with before we close. What does it actually mean to take care of your health after 50? For most of our lives, we were taught to think about health reactively. Something breaks, you fix it. Something shows up on a test, you address it. That model has its place. But after 50, the most important work happens in the space between those interventions. It happens in daily decisions too small to show up in a doctor's appointment and too consistent to be ignored by your biology. Metabolic aging is real. It is measurable. And it is, to a meaningful degree, responsive to the choices you make consistently over time. Not magically responsive, but responsive enough that the difference between a person who understands this process and one who doesn't can become visible in how they feel, how they move, and how clearly they think 5 and 10 years from now. Cinnamon in your morning coffee will not rewrite your biology overnight, but it is one honest, evidence-informed, zero-friction decision you can make starting tomorrow morning. It costs almost nothing. It takes no extra time. And it introduces a compound into the most metabolically significant window of your day that your insulin receptors, your vascular lining, and your brain tissue will all quietly benefit from, 1 cup at a time. That is what intelligent health after 50 looks like. Not grand gestures, small decisions made with understanding, repeated with consistency. If what you heard today shifted something in how you think about your morning routine, share this video with that specific person in your life who has been feeling off lately and hasn't been able to explain why. They need this conversation. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because next week we are going further into the metabolic picture and covering something that affects sleep, weight, and brain health in ways most people over 50 never hear about. This is the channel for people who want to understand what is actually happening inside their bodies and what they can do about it.